There is a warehouse in St. Louis de Blanford, Quebec, that holds something the Canadian government considers a strategic reserve. It is not oil. It is not grain. It is not any material that would come to mind if you were asked to name the things a government might consider worth stockpiling against future shortage. It is maple syrup. Canada produces approximately 70% of the world's maple syrup supply. The province of Quebec produces approximately 90% of Canada's share. The industry generates several $100 million annually in export revenue. And because maple trees produce sap during a narrow seasonal window that varies with weather conditions, a late frost can devastate a season's production, as can an early thaw. The supply is inherently volatile from year to year. The Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers, the cartel that governs production quotas, pricing, and a strategic reserve, decided decades ago that price stability in such a volatile industry required buffering supply fluctuations with a physical inventory reserve. The strategic reserve exists to sell into the market in poor production years, preventing price spikes that would drive buyers to substitute products, and to absorb excess supply in good years, preventing price collapses that would harm producers. In the summer of 2012, auditors conducting the routine inspection of this reserve facility discovered something wrong. The barrels were light. Some were empty. The inventory that was supposed to be there was not there. 3,000 metric tons of maple syrup, worth approximately $18 million, had been stolen. The mechanics of the heist, as they emerged during the subsequent criminal investigation, were notable for their simplicity and their patience. The Federation stored its strategic reserve in a rented warehouse. The syrup sat in large barrels stacked in a standard warehouse facility. Security was not designed for a high-value theft scenario. The strategic reserve had been in operation for years without incident. The product was bulky and difficult to conceal, and syrup is not the first commodity one associates with large-scale organized theft. The thieves had access to the facility as legitimate business operators. They were syrup buyers and producers who moved in and out of the warehouse as part of ordinary industry activity. Over the course of several months in 2011 and 2012, they systematically transferred syrup from the Federation's barrels into their own containers, replacing the Federation's syrup with water or simply leaving the barrels increasingly empty. The inspection process that was supposed to verify the reserve's inventory checked barrel weights periodically, but the frequency and rigor of these checks was insufficient to catch a slow, systematic drain. When the auditors finally weighed barrels more carefully and identified the discrepancy, the full scale of what had happened became apparent. The investigation, led by the Sûreté du Québec, Quebec's provincial police, traced the stolen syrup through a network of buyers, processors, and resellers across Quebec, New Brunswick, and the United States. The central figure identified in the investigation was a syrup producer and independent buyer named Richard Vallières, who was ultimately convicted and sentenced to 8 years in prison. He was not working alone. More than 20 individuals were eventually charged in connection with the theft and the subsequent laundering of the stolen syrup into the legitimate market. The market for stolen maple syrup turned out to be surprisingly accessible, which is both a reflection of the difficulty of tracing syrup through commercial channels and a comment on the structure of the industry. Maple syrup, once it leaves its barrel and enters the processing chain, is difficult to trace to its source. It is a fungible commodity. Syrup of the same grade from different producers is blended together in commercial processing. A processor or blender who purchased stolen syrup, mixed it with legitimate inventory, and sold it forward had effectively laundered the material in a way that was difficult to unwind forensically. The buyers who knowingly or unknowingly purchased stolen syrup included processors in New Brunswick and American buyers who received the product at prices below the Federation's official minimum price. The below-market pricing should have been a signal. Legitimate syrup cannot be sold below the Federation's regulated floor without consequences, so discounted syrup coming from an unexplained source is, in retrospect, an obvious indicator. The degree to which buyers chose not to ask questions about the provenance of attractively priced syrup was a feature of the case that raised questions about industry-wide compliance culture. The stolen syrup that entered American markets where the Federation's price controls did not apply and where regulatory oversight of import documentation was limited, was particularly difficult to trace after the fact. The Federation's response to the heist included significant upgrades to the security and auditing of the reserve facility, which observers noted were changes that probably should have been in place before 3,000 metric tons of its most critical asset were quietly removed over the course of several months. The case also reinvigorated a debate about the structure of the maple syrup industry itself. The Federation's cartel structure, which sets production quotas, controls pricing, and operates the strategic reserve, is one of the most comprehensive commodity marketing boards in the agricultural sector. Its supporters argue that it provides price stability that benefits both producers and consumers in a volatile industry, and that the strategic reserve serves a genuine economic function. Its critics argue that it is a production cartel that restricts competition and innovation, that new producers face significant barriers to entry, and that the quota system has generated its own underground market in which illegally produced syrup is sold outside the Federation system. The same economic pressures, controlled prices, artificial scarcity, buyers willing to pay below market for product of uncertain provenance, that made the heist profitable also characterized the broader gray market in unquoted maple syrup that existed before and after the theft. The Great Canadian Maple Syrup heist attracted international attention that was, in its initial media treatment, somewhat comedic. Headlines around the world treated the idea of a strategic maple syrup reserve and a multi-million-dollar syrup theft as inherently absurd, a Canadian punchline. The comedy obscures what is, structurally, a fairly ordinary story about commodity market regulation, the incentives created by price controls, and the limits of institutional security when insiders have both access and motive. Replace maple syrup with any regulated commodity, wine, grain, petroleum, and the dynamics are entirely familiar. What makes it specifically interesting is the commodity's character. Maple syrup is produced by approximately 11,000 small producers, mostly family farms, in a small geographic area, in a brief seasonal window, from trees that require 40 years to reach productive age. The Federation's system exists because this production profile, small, seasonal, geographically concentrated, requiring long-term investment, makes the industry vulnerable to exactly the price volatility that the reserve is designed to buffer. The theft was not just a theft of a product. It was a theft from the institutional mechanism that keeps thousands of family farms economically viable by maintaining a market price above what an unregulated, volatile market would produce in bad years. Vallières and his associates took $18 million of syrup. The auditors caught them because eventually empty barrels are hard to explain.